Okay, so first things first. The original plan for this video was for it to just be a no commentary split screen comparison between the new Panzer Dragoon Remake and some of the other games in the series, with some of my thoughts on the new version and the series in general appearing in the video description. However, the description was starting to get a bit long, so I thought I'd instead adapt it into a narrated introduction to the video and also just expand a wee smidgeroony more on some of my thoughts on the game and how it stacks up next to Panzer Dragoon Zwei and Panzer Dragoon Orta. I'm not including Panzer Dragoon Saga here, as although it's part of that shared universe of games, its RPG gameplay style doesn't really have anything in common with the other games. The current gen remake of Panzer Dragoon seems to have received some fairly mixed reviews in its initial incarnation on the Switch, with criticism being levelled at both the gameplay and the graphics. As a huge fan of the series, once it came out on PS4, I decided to give it a shot, although I did wait for it to become available at a slightly lower price first in view of the criticism levelled at it. Also, with regards to the criticism of the remake, this is where the idea for a split screen comparison came into my head, as I thought it would be interesting to directly compare this remade version of the first game to those later editions of the Panzer Dragoon series, to see how both their visuals and gameplay stack up next to each other. Now, I haven't gone down the route of a direct comparison with the very first game for one simple reason. Whilst I do consider myself a massive fan of the Panzer Dragoon series, back in the Sega Saturn days, I jumped straight in with Panzer Dragoon Zwei, and I actually bypassed the original game altogether, as the consensus seemed to be from the various Sega Saturn mags that were around at the time that Zwei was the better game of the two. Back then, I was never that bothered about picking up the first game after playing through Zwei, as the impression I'd got was that it was a graphically inferior game with less sophisticated gameplay. Years later though, Panzer Dragoon Orta, an original Xbox exclusive, was actually one of the main reasons I ended up getting that particular console. The original Panzer Dragoon is actually playable as an unlockable bonus in Orta once you beat the game on any difficulty. Once I'd unlocked it, I did play it a little bit with the intention of sinking some decent time into it at some point, but that just never happened for some reason, probably because I was more interested in playing actual Xbox games at the time, rather than revisiting an old Saturn title. So despite being a huge fan of the series, my exposure to the very first game has been very limited, so to all intents and purposes I am actually going into the remake pretty much as a new player. As such, I did wonder about whether the less refined gameplay of the first game might be less appealing to me as a Zwei and Orta veteran. Panzer Dragoon Zwei was one of my favourite ever gaming experiences on the Sega Saturn. My first exposure to the game was on a demo disc that came with the UK official Sega Saturn mag back in the late to mid 90s. The demo featured the third level of the game, the first one you properly fly through in the full game, and it just absolutely blew me away back then, with its amazing for the time graphics and equally amazing orchestral score. The boss at the end of the stage was absolutely jaw-dropping to behold, as it gets flown in from the back of the screen and dropped in front of you, in all of its screeching, limb-flailing, screen-filling glory. The sense of impending peril that's generated as the ominous boss theme slowly builds up, before reaching its crescendo just as it's dropped straight into your flight path, is amazing. It gives me goosebumps now just thinking about it. Let's check it out. The full game didn't disappoint after this particularly memorable demo, and combined some incredibly impressive looking 360-degree rail shooting levels with a majestic, unforgettable orchestral soundtrack, and equally memorable bosses. Each of the bosses had their own individual theme tune too. The lock-on system was intuitive, with your targeting reticule turning red when you targeted the maximum amount of enemies you could shoot down in one go. The ability to switch between the homing lock-on bio lasers and your Dragon Rider's gun felt very natural and easy to pick up. This was combined with an excellent dragon evolution system based on your progress in the game that saw your initially very cute looking little baby dragon gradually evolving into a winged harbinger of death. The more powerful your dragon got, the more enemies you could lock onto and shoot down in one go, and the greater your health and berserk attack got. The berserk attack was your super weapon that would slowly charge up as you played through the level, and when activated would unleash a volley of rapid auto-firing biolasers for a short period of time, raining down maximum destruction on your foes, whilst granting you a brief period of invincibility as the berserk meter slowly drained. The game was pretty challenging, but once you were familiar with the levels and boss patterns, it wasn't too tricky to complete. There were also branching routes through some of the levels, and a whole heap of extras that could be unlocked via the game's secret Pandora's Box option, a feature which, if I recall correctly, first becomes unlocked when you finish the game for the first time. The options in Pandora's Box allowed you to do things like playing as different dragon types that you didn't see in the normal game, like the iconic blue dragon from the first one, and also letting you take control of Zwei's final boss. There was also a stage select, including a secret stage 0, and multiple options to max out your health and berserk gauge. Everything in Pandora's Box would become unlocked by either 100% completing the game, or clocking up 30 hours of gameplay. A very nice touch was that if you played Panzer Dragoon Saga on your Saturn, it unlocked all the Pandora's Box options in Zwei after you saved the game for the first time, which is what I did here using the Panzer Dragoon Saga demo disc that I showed earlier in the video. Although I've still got a Saturn and a copy of Zwei, I'm actually playing it here on SSF emulator on my PC, with the emulator reading my actual PD Zwei disc rather than a downloaded ISO of the game. As well as looking absolutely stunning, Panzer Dragoon Zwei was actually ahead of the curve in other respects too, in the fact it included a widescreen option. Although for some reason it doesn't seem to want to work in SSF. Panzer Dragoon Zwei is without a single shadow of a doubt one of my favourite Saturn games of all time, and it really showed what the system was capable of graphically, for all the naysayers out there who like to doubt the Saturn's 3D polygon capability. Panzer Dragoon Orta was, as I previously mentioned, an original Xbox exclusive, and offered more of the same great gameplay, but with far superior graphics. It was in fact one of the main reasons I decided to trade in my PlayStation 2 and buy an OG Xbox, along with Sega's other gaming masterpiece, Outrun 2. As well as improved graphics, it also updated the gameplay and added in an option to morph your dragon between 3 different forms as you played through each level, a nod back to Panzer Dragoon Saga on the Saturn. It also added in a glide attack which would boost you forward with a brief burst of speed that required a small recharge time. You could use this to accelerate through certain enemy types to destroy them, or to fly around bosses in order to reach their weak spots, making the glide ability a valuable weapon in its own right. The 3 different dragon types you could morph between included Base Wing, the Heavy Wing, and Glide Wing. The Base Wing was the standard dragon, and the one most similar to the dragon from Zwei, with a similar biolaser, standard gun and berserk attack pattern. It allowed you to use 2 glide attacks before they needed recharging. The Heavy Wing had very powerful attacks, but only a maximum of 3 lock-on shots and no glide attack at all, and a berserk attack that allowed you to focus a highly powerful focused beam of energy on your targets. The Glide Wing was the smallest and most agile of the 3, with no lock-on homing lasers whatsoever, but having instead a rapid-fire gun with an enlarged targeting reticule that would automatically target anything inside, and 3 glide attacks that could be used before a recharge was required. Its berserk attack, whilst not nearly as damaging as the other 2 forms, can actually restore a small portion of the dragon's life. The Glide Wing is also capable of performing a barrel roll, something that the Base and Heavy Wings are not able to do. Like Zwei before it, all 3 dragon types could be levelled up and evolved into more powerful forms. As I mentioned earlier, Orta had truly fantastic visuals. I'd go so far as to say that it was probably one of the best looking games on the original Xbox. Like Zwei, it also had an absolutely fantastic musical score as well, although I do think Zwei's was just a smidge better. One tiny nitpicky little criticism of Orta's soundtrack for me is the fact that there were just 2 interchangeable boss themes in it, as opposed to all the individual themes each of Zwei's big baddies got. But having said that, there are considerably more bosses in Orta than Zwei. One area that was a humongous step up from the previous game was the sheer wealth of stuff that could be unlocked in Orta's Pandora's box options. There were encyclopedias worth of background story, full character bios and enemy info, as well as new levels and scenarios involving a young recruit to the Empire called Ivo, as well as the previously mentioned unlockable version of the original Panzer Dragoon game. Like Zwei, Pandora's box also allowed you to select which level you wanted to start on, how your weapons and life bar behaved, which dragon type you wanted, as well as which rider, with Azel from Panzer Dragoon Saga appearing as a selectable character. Let's have a look at some gameplay with these secret selectable forms. The game was absolutely hard as nails too, but was well served as save points. It never felt unfair though, and that death in the game was usually your own fault. The final boss was a multi-form monstrosity that required a ton of memorisation of its attack patterns, and took a long time to take down. The video of it here looked a bit blurry and grainy, as it was originally something I video captured from my original Xbox in standard definition, with a bit of a cheap and crappy capture device. So the reason I'm mentioning all this is that both Zwei and Orta evolved the gameplay of the first game for the better. As I never really played the original, I am effectively going into the remake as a new player, and there are elements of the gameplay here that definitely felt like a step backwards compared to those other 2 games. I think a few of these little nitpicky issues I had are definitely things that were problematic with the Saturn original, whereas others, I think, might be issues with the remake itself. As a modern game coming out in 2020, I think it's a real shame that Megapixel Studios seemingly were content to opt for a warts and all port, rather than taking the opportunity to maybe add in some optional modern tweaks, aside from their one concession to modern gaming, by adding in an optional Call of Duty style twin-stick aiming system. Ugh. In my opinion, both Zwei and Orta have better designed targeting systems, in particular the fact that you've got just a single reticule that changes colour when you've reached the maximum number of lock-ons, rather than the weird rotated box things from the original. I think it's a shame the remake didn't offer an option to alternate, if you so wished it, to a more modern reticule, similar to either Zwei or Orta's, in a similar fashion to how Wipeout HD Fury on the PS3 gave you an option to change its in-game HUD between the modern version or the HUDs found in the classic PS1 titles Wipeout 2097 and Wipeout 3. There was an option in the options screen to toggle a classic reticule on and off, but on my initial playthrough I couldn't see it actually altering anything. I've subsequently found out it changes whether you can see the reticule hovering over the dragon or in front of it. Something else that I think could have been another optional change for the better is the fact that in the first Panzer Dragoon, when you rotate the camera either 90 degrees side to side or 180 degrees behind you, you zoom into a first person mode and lose your positioning control of the dragon. Both Orta and Zwei rotated the camera around the dragon, keeping it in the third person, allowing you a bit of room for manoeuvre. Like I said though, I think these could have been added optional improvements, something you could turn on or off, so the Panzer Dragoon 1 Saturn purists out there can still get the same undiluted experience they no doubt want. In the remake, I feel sort of overly aware that the dragon is sat in the middle of the screen, and the reticule seems to be hovering over it a lot of the time, almost like the dragon's a bit too big and its static position should just hang a bit lower on the screen. I did fire up the original Panzer Dragoon via my copy of Orta, just to compare it, and to me it definitely just doesn't seem quite right in the remake, compared to the original. I also felt like the lock-on felt a bit hit and miss at actually locking onto enemies and boss weak spots at times, like I needed to waggle it over them a few times to actually get it to register. Comparatively, in both Zwei and Orta, the way the dragon and the targeting reticule handled felt immediately intuitive. As you move up, down, left and right on the screen, the dragon and reticule all seem to move in a simultaneous way that helps you aim at baddies and move your dragon to avoid projectiles at the same time, without either thing getting in the way of one another. Also, compared to Zwei and Orta, the dragon feels bigger and it felt a bit harder to avoid enemy ships and attacks, and that I was sometimes getting hit by things I didn't even see coming. Having said that though, despite feeling like it was harder to sometimes see things coming, the game is actually pretty easy to beat. I managed to finish it on my first go on the normal difficulty level with credits to spare. I was even able to beat the final boss on my very first attempt without any difficulty whatsoever. I think part of the difficulty of not seeing enemies and projectiles coming is that on certain stages the enemies seem to be of a very similar colour palette to their surroundings. Stage 4 is mainly greeny bluish, and so are all the enemy types on it. Stage 6 is mainly orangey brownish, and again all the baddies seem to be of a similar colour that makes them hard to pick out from the surrounding background. I've looked at some footage of the original Saturn game Stage 4 and it's much easier to pick out the bad guys from their surroundings, despite the much lower resolution and polygon count of the Saturn compared to the PS4. So it struck me as a bit of a curious artistic choice on Megapixel Studios' behalf that they didn't choose colours that made the enemies stand out a bit more obviously. Having said all that though, for the most part this game is an absolute feast for the eyes, and the graphics do look absolutely gorgeous with some really vibrant and detailed backgrounds and sprites. Special mention must be made for the fact that they all run at a silky smooth 60 frames per second on my PS4. Megapixel Studios, you get an A+ from me for that. Unfortunately though, I am now going to have to dock some of those points for something that I just cannot believe is a thing that I'm seeing in a 2020 PS4 game. Some incredibly highness scenery popping on the first level. If you're not familiar with that term, it's the way the mountains and scenery in the background seem to just sort of appear and then shimmer into existence in the background. Am I being a bit overly harsh by pointing this out? Well, the thing is, I cannot remember the last time I saw this in a modern game, and I just think in this day and age it's just not acceptable. In the split screen comparison that's going to follow, the very first game I chose to compare this first level in the PD Remake to was not one of the other Panzer Dragoon games at all, but in fact Sonic and All-Star Racing Transformed. This was because it's got a Panzer Dragoon themed level which is aesthetically very similar to the opening stage of the PD Remake. The difference being though that it's an 8-year-old game and is managing on my PC to push very similar, equally detailed scenery around at 60 frames per second without a hint of pop-up in sight. Also, and this is just a real personal bugbear, I thought the character models used in the remade version of the original game's animated intros seemed a tad low effort. I mean, the hero here just looks a bit like a gimpy, stiffly animated, dead-eyed marionette. Compare this to the beautifully rendered animated intro from Orta, and just how much more expression and character there is in Orta's face. I get that Megapixel Studios aren't a big budget studio, so we're not going to get something like one of the almost photorealistic looking cutscenes from something like Star Wars Battlefront 2, but was this dead-eyed, expressionless fuckwit really the best they could come up with? I probably sound like I'm being ridiculously overcritical now, but as the very first thing when you start the game, this didn't make a particularly good first impression. Anyway, so these are just a few of my thoughts about the remake and the other games in the series and how they compare to it. I'll probably sound like I'm really sticking the boot into the new game, but don't get me wrong, I don't dislike it. As I'd previously mentioned, it is for the most part an absolutely gorgeous looking game that does run at 60 frames a second, and on the whole it plays pretty well too. It's just I can't help but feel it could have been so much better if Megapixel had just decided to modernise a few more elements of it, to reflect the fact that the later games in the original series had evolved the gameplay over the first one. And don't let my criticism of the game affect your enjoyment of it. If you think I'm talking out of my arse and that it's just perfect as it is, then that's fine, we can agree to differ. Anyway, as I stated at the start, I originally hadn't planned on doing any commentary in this split screen comparison, and Jesus, I certainly hadn't intended for it to be this long. It's just something that was born initially out of necessity, of the planned video description getting too long, and ended up taking on a life of its own. So enough talking now, let's crack on and get this split screen complete playthrough party started.
Dominate! Ice! Agora Pisce! Quelna Sentry!
Atare! Ich will los!
安定スキアハのアムレスエルワッテ
die Notes.
Okay, well that is the end of the video now, so I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. This has been Mr. Thunderwing. I will catch you again sometime soon. Bye!